Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles issues affecting your rights and matters of legal recourse. My name is Dumile Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights and Recourse or calling our studio line at 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. The Workers' Day spirit is expected to continue throughout this month as workers' rights come under the spotlight. And this is also being a wage negotiation season. Issues around remunerations particularly take center stage. And that's why today on Rights and Recourse we throw our attention on a contentious wage issue that is still being thrashed out at NEDLAC. And this is the hotly debated subject of the national minimum wage. To help me through that discussion, let me extend a warm welcome to Mr. Virgil Seafield, Deputy Director General from the Department of Labour, Mr. Joseph Makgekeni, President of NACTU, and in our Cape Town studio, we are joined by Mr. Neil Coleman, Strategies Coordinator for the COSATU Secretariat. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon.
First of all, I would like all of you to just give me a comment on this issue. On Friday, we celebrated Workers' Day, and 20 years into our democracy, is there something to celebrate in these 21 years that we have been celebrating Workers' Day?
Good morning, good afternoon. You see, for us as NACTU, we have nothing to celebrate in 2015 because our members of AMCO and affiliate of NACTU were gunned down by the police in August 2012. There was a Fallen Commission, the retired judge. Fallen Commission has issued the report, and then we had hoped during the Workers' Day we will have that report. Unfortunately, we don't have it.
But that's a recent issue, but anyway, let's go to Neil in Cape Town. Neil, is there something for the workers to celebrate 21 years after the Workers' Day was made a public holiday in South Africa?
Yes, I think there are definitely things to celebrate. There have been important advances that have been made, but I think it's also true that we are far from where we should be. 21 years into democracy. And I think the levels of, in particular in relation to the subject we're talking about now, the levels of poverty amongst working people are far too high. And the levels of inequality between the top and the bottom continues to grow. And I think that's precisely where we need urgent interventions around the wage structure, around the way in which the economy works. And I'm sure we'll go into some of those issues.
Before I go into that, let me get a view from Mr. Virgil Seafield from the department.
I think we need to have a more expansive view of the relevance of Workers' Day. I think Workers' Day celebrates the contribution of workers in this country to where we are currently, more than just the issues that currently is on the table that we talk about. But I think there's a more expansive understanding of the relevance of their contribution, of workers' contribution to the liberation struggle, to where we are, to the current debate that we have around the table, that we can sit around the table and have a discussion around the national minimum wage is reflective of the contribution of workers in this country to a very large extent.
How far is that discussion at NEDLAC, Mr. Seafield?
I think the debate is still. I think the debate is still open. I think we have dealt with the issue of the terms of reference of the national minimum wage. I think there's some issues around how we implement and get around doing and setting a minimum wage. And I think those are the things that still need to be threshed out. I don't want to go into what the level should be or when it should be in place. But I think working out the mechanics of establishing a minimum wage, I think those are the issues that are currently being debated at NEDLAC right now.
The demand by AMCU on the Platinum Belt calling for 12,500 Rand as an entry-level wage, did that throw the cat among the pigeons?
In our view, it is still very relevant because indeed the mining sector, in particular platinum, is making money. And if you look at the environment and the workers are working under, and the remuneration that they are getting, in our view, even the national minimum wage, if we are to go there in details, I know, is one of the sectors that we believe your entry level, 12,500, is very fair and reasonable.
Neil, did not throw the cat among the pigeons. I know you have definite views around this issue.
Well, there's nothing wrong with workers demanding 12,500. I think if we look at the cost of living today, it's not unreasonable. But we also need to look at the current wage structure. And the latest figures from Statistics South Africa are that half of South Africa's workers earn below 3,033 Rand a month. Half of South Africa's workers. So the question is, what role should a minimum wage, a national minimum wage floor play? And what role should centralized bargaining and sectoral agreements in particular industries play? And internationally, and we believe it's the case in South Africa as well, the role of the national minimum wage is to set a wage floor, and then for the sectors to negotiate above that according to their conditions. And what we've said is that the level of the national minimum wage should be related to two things. The one is the cost of living for the basic cost of living for a family of about four, which many low-income workers have to support. And secondly, we need to look at the national average wage, and the proportion of that national average wage which is used internationally to peg the national minimum wage is often between 40 and 50%. Now, our national minimum wage is sitting at below 20% of our national average, so it's much too low. I beg your pardon, our minimum wage, our lowest minimum wage is currently. So I think we need to recognize that the national minimum wage that's introduced won't immediately satisfy the requirements of a living wage. In other words, a wage in which a worker and their family can live decently and afford a whole range of necessities. But it's aimed to bring workers out of poverty. And therefore, the sorts of figures that were spoken about by COSATU, and we haven't said that this is the figure for the national minimum wage, were around 5,000 Rand a month. And even that, we're going to have to look at how we work our way towards that figure, given the low wage structure in South Africa at the moment.
Well, you'll have a difficult time convincing AMCU about this 5,000 Rand, but let me go back to you. You made a point saying the minimum wage must still leave room for bargaining by the unions. Can you explain that a little?
So all the minimum wage does, a national minimum wage provides a floor. And it says nobody in the country, unless there are agreements to make exceptions in particular sectors or for particular employers, but for argument's sake, let's say there are no exceptions, then that floor means that no worker can earn below that national minimum. And then over and above that, what you have throughout the world where there's a national minimum wage is you have sectoral bargaining, in which workers and employers get together, like we do now in our bargaining councils, and negotiate above that level of the national minimum wage. So each sector would have a range of minima which are above that level. They cannot be below that level. And ultimately, the hope is that fewer and fewer workers would be covered by that national minimum wage, and more workers would be covered by the higher minimum set in the various sectors.
I said earlier, Mr. Malkolageni, that he is going to have a difficulty in convincing AMCU to accept the 5,000 minimum wage.
You see, Mr. Mateza, what we are agreed with COSATU is that the national minimum wage is a floor, but you have got sectors through collective bargaining, of which AMCU and the chemical and other sectors should negotiate. We still believe in their collective bargaining, even at the gold as they start negotiating this month. 12,500 is affordable and fair. So you talk of sectors as well as collective bargaining.
When we come back, we'll get to that. If you'd like to join our discussion, you can call us on 011-714-5497-5498 or tweet us at Recourse or email us at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. When we come back, we'll talk to you about the difference between the national minimum wage and sectoral determination. Don't go away. Stay with us.
Information-hungry viewers stay with SABC News, as issues on the West are different from issues on the East or here in Johannesburg. So it is not surprising that people who follow the news know that there are two things for sure: that anything can happen, and SABC News will tell you when it does. Because we keep the nation fully informed. We are SABC News.
Media Monitor. The title says it all.
We do have a dilemma here because Lesotho is a sovereign country. I don't think it is the obligation of South Africa's media to even tell the people of Lesotho what's going on in Lesotho.
Join our panel of experts as they unpack and monitor all the leading and breaking news stories making waves in the print and social media platforms. That's Media Monitor with me, Alicia Jali.
Sundays at 9 a.m. only on the SABC News channel.
Welcome back to Rise and Recourse and continue our discussion here on the national minimum wage debate. Mr. Virgil Seafield from the department. The department is busy implementing sectoral determinations. The last time I heard you were dealing with the domestic workers. What's the difference between a national minimum wage and sectoral determination?
Can I just understand? Create an understanding of how minimum wage setting happens in South Africa. I think there are different forms and ways in which minimum wage setting happens in South Africa. One, there's bargaining councils where wages are set, where we don't have a responsibility, but the social partners in the bargaining council determine what they can and cannot afford and bargain for a wage. Then what we have in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act is sectoral determination. Sectoral determinations fundamentally set around different sectors. We have, for example, domestic workers, farm workers, we have contract cleaning, we have private security, we have civil engineering. So we have a range of minimum wage. But the minimum wage in terms of sectoral determination is exactly as the social partners have indicated. It's a floor from which the department would set a basic minimum wage in consultation with the stakeholders, and they can bargain beyond that in terms of collective bargaining. It is a floor that takes a number of things into consideration. It takes the ability of the employer to carry out his business. It takes the alleviation of poverty. It takes the effect it would have on employment, creation and the retention of employment opportunity. It takes into consideration minimum wage levels, living levels in the country, so that the minimum wage is set exactly as that, a minimum wage floor under which nobody should be paid. And that's a minimum wage. In terms of a national minimum wage, obviously would cover all sectors, and how these sectoral determinations or sectoral wages will fit into this minimum wage is still a debate that needs to happen, whether they should stand on their own or have a national minimum wage that cuts across all other sectors. That's a debate that still needs to happen at NEDLEC or at the appropriate level.
Neil, is a national minimum wage the living wage COSATU was crying out about in the 1980s, just in another name, or are those two sides of different coins?
Exactly, they're two related but distinct things. As I indicated, the national minimum wage is a floor. The living wage is something that unions and workers strive for above that national minimum wage level. It's the sort of thing that the president of NACTU was talking about, the 12,500 that workers were struggling for in the platinum belt. So the national minimum wage provides a platform in order to struggle for living wages in all the different sectors. And what research has shown internationally, this is, if you look at the UK, if you look at Brazil, Australia, many, many countries, is that the setting of a national minimum wage floor and the improvement of that floor actually creates a situation in which higher up the wage structure, that actually improves the position of workers higher up as well. And when I say higher up, I mean particularly in the lower half of the wage structure. It's what economists call wage compression. So this reduces the level of wage inequality, which is precisely what we're wanting to achieve. So having the national minimum wage together with the living wage would gradually ratchet up the wage structure, and it would force employers and companies in general to reconfigure the wage structure, much like we've seen in the public sector, where after 1994, you had the wages of the bottom brought up to the greatest extent, and wages at the top were capped to a certain degree. So I think that's what we're looking at in terms of the broad overall wage policy. And in terms of economic policy, why this is very important is that it puts far more income in the hands of the low paid, and that introduces a massive boost to the economy. If correctly handled, that can link increased wages to employment generation if it's linked to the appropriate industrial and economic policies.
If you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Neil was saying, is that research that we've done in the Department of Labor and across a number of sectors is that the minimum wage has actually ratcheted up the wage. But unfortunately, what we see in terms of wage setting as a minimum wage at a sectoral level, that becomes the actual wage instead of the minimum wage. For example, in the private security sector, as a case in point, that wage is the wage that is being paid to workers rather than being able to negotiate upwards in terms of it. And that's one of the concerns that we've raised around this. But fundamentally, it addresses those issues. It has also addressed a number of issues. I say that a minimum wage provides a better mechanism for poverty alleviation than all of the other ways in which we try to alleviate poverty, such as, for example, your pension, your social security
and the social
issues,
grants.
and the social grants.
The other thing, are we not running into a problem? Probably, Mr. McCracken, you can answer this question. I want Neil to answer this question too. Are we not running into a problem when we compare our situation to internationally, where there are growth in those economies, and our economy is not growing?
No, we are not in this manner, which I can also bring to the floor and to the nation. On the 18th of April, at NEDLEC, the Committee of Principals, led by Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, all parties have agreed, government, business, labor, and community, that indeed your national minimum wage must be the floor. So we are happy with that. And also, if you look at the internationals, there has been an invitation to Germany so that we can look at their practice. Our people must go there. Deputy President and ourselves, we have agreed that the international experts in this field must come to South Africa and educate the principals and educate the nation that indeed there's no danger, even if the economy is not growing. What it does, it closes the gap or reduces the gap of inequality between those who are highest paid and those who are very low.
Neil, a link to that question is the question of, should a national minimum wage be linked to productivity, for instance?
Well, just before I come to that, I think it's important to add on to what Joseph Makakeni has said, which is that if you look at the Latin American experience, what happened when this policy of progressively increasing the real value of the national minimum wage was introduced in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and a number of other countries. Many of those economies were in crisis. They weren't growing. There were serious problems. Unemployment was on the rise, et cetera, et cetera. And what you found is that with the introduction of higher minimum wages, it gave, as I indicated earlier, a huge economic boost to those societies, which also introduced a much more activist role for the state in promoting industrial growth, etc. And this is where we're saying wage policies must be linked to other economic and industrial and sectoral policies. When the president of Brazil spoke to our executive in November 2013, he put it very nicely. He said, workers and the poor, when they spend on the things that are produced locally. And when we put money in the hands of the workers and the poor in Brazil, the giant wheel of the Brazilian economy started turning. And that's how we need to think of it. So in relation to your question about productivity, we need to look at not just the question of productivity of workers, but of productivity of the economy and of companies as a whole. And going the high road of promoting more investment in people, more training, better wages, better productivity of the economy has been shown to internationally to create a virtuous cycle. And what we had with apartheid was a low-wage strategy which sought to make profits on the back of cheap labor. And unfortunately, 21 years down the road, we still have that situation where 50% of African workers, according to the latest Stats SA survey, are earning below 2,800 Rand a month. And the position in relation to white workers is very different, and so on. So we have to break with that strategy. So yes, raising wages, a new wage policy, will help with ratcheting up the productivity of the economy and releasing resources which were previously pent up, such as domestic consumption, but also the productivity of the economy more broadly.
Let's take this call from Gift from the Free State. Gift, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. What's your question?
Good afternoon, Dumile. Good afternoon, Babu Joseph Lakonosegil. You know, there's a problem that as a labor or as a Marxist we are facing that market is that we have a government that doesn't tell us the truth. Our government is full of lies. Every time when they come to us, they promise, they don't perform. That's the problem of the government. Because they have been saying or talking about the minimum wage for the past 10 or 20 years back. Even today, we are still fighting for a minimum wage. How can it happen? For the past 21 years, we are still fighting for one thing, minimum wage. If we talk about increment in the company, we get killed. Look at Marigani. People will get killed for a year 2005, where the mines are doing a lot of money, but people get killed for 2005. How are we going to get forward with our own government that doesn't protect the labor?
Well, thank you very much. There are discussions taking place at NEDLEC. Probably you can give us how far are these discussions?
Look, I think Mr. Makenke has raised the issues in terms of where the level of discussion is currently with the national minimum wage. But I want to address some of the issues that was raised by the caller in government not doing.
Can we raise that when we come back from the break, and then talk about that? If we can just finalize that part you were saying, Mr. Makenke was saying, and then we can go to the caller. I want us to have time to respond to the caller.
Look. The understanding of the level of debate at NEDLEC is fundamentally around some areas of agreement in terms of what should inform the minimum wage, what are the principles that should inform what the minimum wage should be. And Mr. Makenke has raised the issue around that being a national flaw. I think the terms of reference have been finalized. There's still a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of the affordability of the minimum wage needs to be determined. So a number of research projects need to happen. It needs to cut across all sectors of the economy, etc., etc. So those issues still needs to be finalized.
Well, if you'd like, we'll continue our discussion. We'll respond to Gift, and when we come back, and if you'd like to join us like Gift did, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Stay with us.
Here's what's happened. Turned 16, got my nails did, new shoes, new hair, oh, and a new ID. I'm on a roll, chummies, and you can be too. The voters roll. So grab your ID, head to your local IEC office, get registered, get on the roll.
I must say that goal was outstanding.
Made so much dust that I couldn't see and I hit a stone and we had a puncture.
Catch all these and more every day on Sports Live at 8:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the national minimum wage. Mr. Makakeni, before we went to the break, you wanted to come in and just give us a heads up as what's happening at Nedlec.
Yes, indeed. The timeline is July. We must have a feedback. The intention from the Egoruleni declaration on the November 4th last year was that by July, a report must go to the Deputy President. We have had the first meeting, so things are getting there, and we are all eager to complete the work by July this year. There's no time to rest. I mean, gift, you are right, we are taking long, but we rely on you guys from the Free State and other areas that if you are members of the union, you must make us work for our money.
Mr. Seafield, you wanted to respond to gift.
Yes, and I think Mr. Makakene has addressed this issue that labor policy, the development of labor policy since 1994 is a product of consultation, social dialogue between employers and employees at Nedlec. And therefore the responsibility of developing this process is a shared responsibility. And when we talk about government developing labor policy, we talk about this consultation, this social dialogue that needs to happen. All of our labor legislation as it is as a product of this legislation, social dialogue.
Neil, what happens if industry does challenge sectoral determination and the national minimum wage? I know there's agreement at Nedlec, but what we saw during the NUMSA strike, where SIFSA and NUMSA agreed on a certain minimum, the other employers said they are not going to sign this deal.
Yeah, I mean, this raises the problem. Virgil's been speaking about the new labor relations dispensation. And our assessment of the labor relations dispensation is that it hasn't met the objectives which were set, either in the Labor Relations Act or in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. And that's why we called for the national minimum wage to be part of a package of reform of our labor dispensation, building on what we attempted to achieve in the LRA and BCA, but acknowledging that it is too voluntarist. In other words, it relies too much on employers coming to the table voluntarily, which employers never do. The experience of employers around the world, including around this issue of the national minimum wage, is that they always resist, they'll attempt to undermine it, and this is our experience in the negotiations, is that employers want to resist the introduction of a national minimum wage. They want to keep it at such a low level that it has no impact on the current wage structure. They don't want to go into the bargaining councils, as we saw in the metal industry. They want to collapse the bargaining councils, and therefore we're saying that the system of negotiations, collective bargaining, wage setting, etc., needs review, it needs an overhaul, and therefore we see the national minimum wage as being part of that process. And part of the problem that you have with the sectoral determinations is that those are set by the minister through the Department of Labour, and they set in sectors where the workers are the most vulnerable and unorganized. And therefore the result of those sectoral determinations leave a lot to be desired and are set way below the minimum living level on which any family needs to exist. So there are many issues which need to be addressed, and we hope that the Labour Relations Task Team in NEDLAC, as well as the Wage Inequality Task Team in NEDLAC, will begin to deal with these matters in a comprehensive manner.
Virgil, Neil mentioned the fact that all of these is the industry can do it voluntarily. By the way, I just want to say we did try and get hold of BUSA to be part of this discussion. For some unknown reason, they were not able to be here today. Virgil, you want to respond to Neil says this is voluntary, and in other words, they might not want to do it, even if it's agreed at NEDLAC.
Look, to some extent, Neil is correct in terms of the voluntarist nature of compliance in the country. But the legislation is very clear in terms of its compliance framework. We've tried in the package of issues that we've put under for consultation at NEDLAC, and which we've concluded in the Labour Relations Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Employment Equity Act, the Public Employment Services Act, as part of this package of issues that Neil is talking to, we've put on the table, we've discussed, we've put in policy. And the enforcement framework within the legislation has been ratcheted up to some extent, so that it tries to minimize non-compliance with the legislation. It has put the responsibility of compliance not on the Department of Labour, not on government, but the responsibility to comply with legislation is fundamentally that of the employer. And therefore, the responsibility is squarely placed on that. Our responsibility is to monitor compliance and not to ensure that company X would comply. If company X doesn't want to comply, the enforcement regime within all of these pieces of legislation that I've raised is clearly set out, and it takes up till the Labour Court in dealing with these issues. So the enforcement process is there. It is how we utilize that in order to engender this culture of a reformed labour relations environment.
Mr. McCoy, you wanted to add there?
Yes, I wanted to add that indeed voluntarism to belong to bargaining council, it is there. What we need to do is that workers themselves, when they see non-compliance, they must report. Department of Labour will be quick to do that. And also, workers must belong to unions, because we are the agent of change. If they don't, non-compliant, will be solved for the day. Even when we talk of the national minimum wage, it's not driving people away from bargaining council. It's a minimum. But on bargaining council, you can get more.
Neil, another thing that Mr. McClagany has raised here about workers must belong to unions. How does the labor unions fight as a united force when there's so much division in that area?
Well, I think there are two issues. The one is the issue you've just raised now around division, and clearly there has to be a renewal of the trade union movement. We have to go back to basics. We have to ensure that democracy is alive in the trade union movement, and that workers' needs and interests are catered for, and that workers themselves are better organized. But the second thing is that throughout the world, particularly in the era of neoliberalism, employers have used the deregulation, the voluntarism, the contracting out, casualization, all of these things to make it very difficult for workers to organize and belong to trade unions. So all those workers, for example, employed by labor brokers, all those workers in the most vulnerable sectors, it's very, very difficult for them to organize. I agree with the NACTU president, it must happen. But this government has a key role to play in assisting that in happening. If you look at a country like Uruguay in Latin America, what they've done is they've got wall-to-wall collective bargaining. The state has basically required that councils are set up in every sector of the economy, and every sector there are negotiations and agreements are reached between the employers and the unions, which are then applied to every single worker in the country. And so I think we have to recognize that the power relations are extremely unequal. Introducing a national minimum wage and some of the other measures which government is introducing and which the ANC has undertaken to introduce in the election manifesto will assist in doing that. but far more needs to be done. So while we welcome the discussion that's taking place around the national minimum wage, that must be part of a far broader discussion to ensure a far more coherent approach to both the design of our labor relations architecture, but also, as Virgil was saying, how do we ensure that the laws, once they are introduced, are properly implemented, both through proper organization by workers, but through much greater capacity and will by government and the Department of Labor. And finally, a national minimum wage will definitely assist that process, because everybody in the country will be aware of their rights under that wage. And it'll be much easier to enforce, because people will report it, they know what their rights are, and it'll be easier for both the Department of Labor and workers to take it forward.
Let's take this call from Noku in the Northwest. Noku, good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Hello, how are you, sir?
Well, thanks. How are you? What's your question?
Good.
What's your question, Noku?
My question is, these issues, we knew about them before we even come into power after 1994. Why don't they just be implemented? Because we know our people on the ground, they are suffering, and those people are the ones who are contributing to our economy. Without workers who are working on the ground there, we cannot be economically effective in South Africa. Why don't we just give them what will be good for them, so that we can be able to move forward? Because it seems as if we're just talking, nothing is happening.
Thank you very much, Noku. We've heard your question. Noku saying we've been talking about this since 1994, 21 years ago. We're still talking about it. When are we moving forward? Why are we not implementing?
Maybe let me remind Nogu, Northwest. You see, Nogu, during Codesa time, the right to strike, there was resistance to include the right to strike into the Constitution. Workers of this country, COSATU, NACTU, we stood together, and that came into the Constitution. We're saying to the workers, as we discuss these issues at NEDLAC, with government and business and community, workers must join unions so that we can be strong, so that we can unite, stand together. On the issue that you raised, Dumile, the issue of division within the labor movement, it is very unfortunate, and employers are going to use that. We must understand. That's why it's hurting to see what is happening in the trade union movement in this country. Whilst we were trying to get together, we're still trying to get together. You see these divisions. That takes away our intention. As Nogu says, it takes away the intention to ensure that by July, the national minimum wage becomes a reality, not in 1994.
Well, if you'd like to join us today in today's discussion, you can still call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights Recourse, or email us at rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. You can also find us on YouTube. After every show, you can find every show on YouTube and have a look and listen to what we have been saying, and you can continue the discussion on Twitter long after the program has ended. Stay with us.
Your World makes it its business every evening to round up the leading local stories and international news to keep you informed all the time.
Make a date with Your World every evening for all the news headlines around the world to keep you abreast with knowledge.
Catch Your World for headlines across the world every Monday to Friday from 9 p.m, then Saturday and Sunday from 7 p.m.
Welcome to Network, a technology news program that also discusses what's trending in social media in and around Africa. MTN has launched its new movie and television streaming service, Front Row. If it's trending, we will find it. That's Network with me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. only on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the issue of the national minimum wage. Let us ask this question while we wait for the call on the line. Can Neil and Mr. Makrekeni, can a divided labor movement influence the creation of a radical economic transformation? Neil, probably you want to have a first bite on that.
Clearly not. I think a weak and divided labour movement is not going to be able to make the sort of interventions and the progress which we've managed to make in the past. And I think this is the critical period. You talk about radical economic transformation. Many of the issues which the labour movement has put on the table in the past, the issue of wage inequality, the question of industrialization, the question of economic development and appropriate economic policies. Those are now on the national agenda. The point is that these terms are used. We've just heard about the industrialization strategy for SADC. But what's the content of that? Is that really the content that we're wanting to see? Has the trade union movement been properly involved in shaping that and giving it the type of content which is going to be in the interests of workers in the long term? These are the questions. And I think that only a strong labour movement is going to be able to do this effectively. Having said this, the fact that there are divisions and problems in the labour movement doesn't mean that we must now fold our hands and become victims of the situation. We have to act to the best of our ability, but at the same time, renew the movement to address the internal problems that we're facing.
Mr. Makrekeni, do you want to add to what Neil was saying about can a divided labour movement actually create, have an influence in the creation of a radical economic transformation?
I agree with Neil. We cannot even start. It's a non-starter. For example, in the newspapers of today, the issue of tax incentives is very clear. It has been used by labor brokers. If we were united...
Let's wait around that question.
Okay.
We'll come back to that.
I
just want to take this call from Ngosi from Mpumalanga. Ngosi, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yebo Matheza kunjani baba?
Sikhona kunjani?
Ngiyabona. Baba Matheza ngiyabinga ngidalele lapha baba. Baba lapha ubaba uMakrekeni into ayikhulumayo. Ngikhuluma nge-minimum wage. Mina ngisebenza kwenye i-project lana enkulu lapha eSouth Africa noma ngivumelekile ukuthi ngayibala ngegama.
Isho le project enkulu okhuluma ngayo.
Ya, yiMedupi Power Station baba. Bakhulu bathiwa izotholakala 8% implement agreement sasithole 7.5 kunyaka 7%. Akwenzekanga lokho labelungu futhi into ayibalayo kwaMakrekeni kunyenye into abayibalayo bayisebenzisayo lapho ukuthi letayikhuluma inomsa baba isidayisile lapha ngaphakathi umanje kune-strike esikhona bathi asikho emthethweni asipublishe baba lapha abasebenzi silambile nje kumanje baba.
Right, Sixzwile Mfokanazi. Neil, for your benefit and Mr. Sifil's benefit, is Ngosi saying that he's working at Medupi and they are not getting the amount of money they are supposed to be getting, and that's going to lead to frustrations. We all know that Medupi and Kusile are the elephants in the room when it comes to energy in this country.
Do you want to
yes.
Because I think you raise a question of enforcement. You raise a question that says that when there's non-compliance with the legislation, how do we enforce that legislation? I think the process in terms of enforcement is very clear. That says that if you're not being paid what has been agreed upon, whether there's a collective bargaining process or whether there's a minimum wage set, your recourse would be to the Department of Labour to call our officers and address this issue of non-compliance with the legislation. Our inspectors are geared to deal with this issue very effectively, I would argue.
There's also the issue of, I think Neil raised the issue of an industrial policy for SADC. But what happened to our industrial policy? Was it not being discussed at NEDLEC too?
Indeed, it was discussed at NEDLEC. What you need now is implementation. The implementation cannot happen, like we said, if labor is divided as is happening now. But we are not folding our arms. We are talking this thing with the Department of Trade and Industry, that let's implement what we said we'll do. Coming back to Mr. Ngosi, quick one. I think, Ngosi, First thing, our call to workers, whether you are a member of NACTU, COSATU, or independent union, there are laws in this country that regulate the labor relations market. If you go to an unprotected or called illegal strike, what happens when you are on strike, as is the case, as I understand, goes the same, the attention changes for you to getting money. It now focuses on protecting your work. So people must not go in that direction that is not protected, because it really changes. It's not that you are sold out, but if the strike is not protected, don't go on strike. That's what we did in a number, you saw what happened in Northwest Marigani. So we are urging workers that let's follow the laws. They're not perfect. They take time. You need just to be patient.
Neil, is the adversarial nature of our relationship between labor and business delaying the growth of an economy, like as we need a growth in this economy in South Africa, as we all agree?
Well, a degree of adversarialism is inherent to our economic system, because the interests of workers and employers tends to go in opposite directions. But I think it's about the degree of adversarialism and whether you can have a type of tension which can be constructively managed. And I think what you're hearing from all the callers is a higher degree of frustration and disillusionment with the way in which the system is functioning. And it relates to the point which I raised earlier, that there are too many holes, there are too many loopholes, there's too much voluntarism in the system, which allows employers in particular to get away with murder. And I think that if we're going to move the economy onto a higher plane, and if we're going to move our labor relations framework onto a different footing and a different level, then there's some structural issues which need to be addressed.
Can we hold that thought, Neil? Can we hold that thought?
As we can hear from a lot of the callers.
Can we hold that thought, and then we can talk?
And what is starting to happen, as the NACTU president was saying, with wildcat strikes, with lack of collective bargaining in certain sectors, is that it puts a tremendous strain on our labor relations framework. And that's when things begin to break down. And I think that's when employers begin to wake up too late to the fact that the system isn't working, and that a non-cooperation on their side and voluntarism on their side is actually in the end going to be more costly than being part of a structured framework in which they agree to negotiate with recognized trade unions, and in which they don't try to undermine the ability of trade unions to organize and represent their members.
Well, we'll go to a break now. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can still call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. When we come back, I would like us to hone into these structural changes. The structural changes Neil is talking about. I know he's written somewhere that we have not changed the apartheid structural changes that are giving rise to these comments that are made by the callers. Don't go away. We'll be back after the break.
That goal was outstanding.
Made so much dust that I couldn't see, and I hit a stone, and we had a function.
Catch all these and more every day on Sports Live at 8:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel. Information-hungry viewers stay with SABC News, as issues on the West are different from issues on the East or here in Johannesburg. So it is not surprising that people who follow the news know that there are two things for sure: that anything can happen, and SABC News will tell you when it does. Because we keep the nation fully informed. We are SABC News.
Welcome back. We are still talking the national minimum wage. There are a lot of other things that are contributing towards that. One of them, Neil talks about, Mr. Seafield, Neil talks about structural changes that need to take place, which never took place from apartheid days. And also the other thing I wanted to respond to is organizations, multilateral organizations around the world, like the IMF and the World Bank, actually saying our labor market is inflexible.
Two things that I wanted to raise. One is the issue of the fundamentals that underpin our labor regime. A number of studies, those are organizations that you're referring to. The IMF, the World Bank says the fundamentals that underpin our labor regime is fine. There's nothing wrong with the fundamentals that underpin our labor regime.
What about the inflexibility?
I'm coming to the inflexibility. So do they say that you can't fire in South Africa? Well, people are being fired every day.
No, they say it's very difficult to fire somebody.
So you want to get rid of somebody just for the sake of getting rid of somebody? I think the fundamentals that underpin our regime, our dismissal policy in terms of our legislation, we think it protects the workers and it protects the organization in which these workers work as well. There are two reasons why where you can challenge these things: whether the process is fair and whether the reason for dismissal is a fundamental reason. Otherwise, we believe in South Africa that our labor policy is not inflexible, it's not rigid. In fact, there's a lot of mechanisms in our legislation that addresses this flexibility. For example, when employers can't afford to pay a minimum wage, they can apply to have a minimum. That's one thing. The second thing is the collective bargaining process allows parties to negotiate on issues.
And give and take.
So I'm concerned about this notion of inflexibility.
Let me come to something else, Neil. I'm coming to you, Mr. McCracken. I just want to go back to Neil about the issue of the industrial policy. Neil, the industrial policy, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is an integral part of the NDP, the National Development Plan. How far is COSATU and the government in meeting each other around this issue of the National Development Plan?
No, well, actually, Dumile, you put your finger on the problem because the industrial strategy is not part of the NDP. The government's IPAP, the Industrial Policy Action Plan, nowhere in the 460 or whatever it is pages of the NDP, the IPAP is not mentioned once. So there is no industrial policy in the National Development Plan, and that constituted one of our core critiques and objections to the National Development Plan. At the same time, you've got the Minister of Trade and Industry and Economic Development very energetically trying to bring about an effective industrial strategy, but the other part of government, headed by Treasury, is pushing economic policy in a different direction. So if you look at our most recent budget, we are living in the times of austerity now. There are cutbacks, there's an attempt to shrink the budget in various key areas, and so on. So the idea of an expansionary industrial policy just is not on the cards. The policy is not the issue. The issue is resourcing it, having other elements of government policy put in place, such as appropriate monetary policies, appropriate fiscal policies, to drive and ensure that that industrial policy is effective. And that currently is not the case. Secondly, Dumile, I think it's important when we talk about the IMF and World Bank to just check which side of the mouth they're talking out at in a particular report, because they're completely schizophrenic organizations. On the one hand, they might talk about labor and flexibility, but on the other, recent reports by the IMF and World Bank have actually shown that labor market deregulation has never assisted in economic development anywhere in the world. Secondly, there's a report by the IMF recently which shows that declining trade union membership has led to much higher levels of inequality. So in fact, many of the arguments that the IMF and World Bank researchers are putting forward reinforce what we are saying. The problem is when the IMF and World Bank go into particular parts of the world and intervene in relation to governments, then they throw their research out the window and they try and drive much more ideologically driven neoliberal programs.
Let's get a final word from you, Mr. Mokrakeni.
Final word is I hope and eager that before the end of 2015, the national minimum wage will be a reality. It will be law. It will no longer be talking at neglect. All parties, as Labour, were ready that by the end of July, indeed, that must come into place.
Mr. Seafield, I know it's not your area of responsibility. The public sector unions are negotiating with the government. Should we expect a strike, or are they going to settle?
You're absolutely right. It's not my area of expertise, and therefore I won't make an assumption on whether we're going to strike or not, since I'm also a public sector worker. But can I just quickly just
add?
Go
ahead.
I think the development of all of these policies, whether it's a national minimum wage, whether it's industrial policy, should be a construct of social dialogue. I think we need to have all of the social partners take part and take ownership of this debate.
Well, yes, as we say, the debate continues. You can continue the debate on Twitter at Rights Recourse. This has been Rights Recourse. This program is repeated at 10 tonight and at 5 on Monday morning. From all of us in the studio, thank you to our guests and good afternoon.
Say that goal was outstanding.
Made so much dust that I couldn't see, and I hit a stone, and we had a function.
Catch all these and more every day on Sports Live at 8:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel. Information-hungry viewers stay with SABC News, as issues on the West are different from issues on the East or here in Johannesburg. So it is not surprising that people who follow the news know that there are two things for sure: that anything can happen, and SABC News will tell you when it does. Because we keep the nation fully informed. We are SABC News.
The issue becomes on how you do what you want to do in effecting change. Change has to happen. There's no question about that.
African heroes who have not been feted, who do not have the statues and the memorials.
We misunderstood reconciliation to mean status quo should be preserved in some instances.
I was asking people who are managing Hector Peterson, they said to us, no, the person who's cleaning the area, an ordinary person, not even the curator, somebody who's cleaning, the area there, an ordinary person in the street will fight with you if you do anything wrong with those statues.
That's Rights and Recourse, Sundays 2 p.m. on SABC News.